Welcome to today's webinar, Attackers Will Get In, Defend Your Assets and Critical Systems with Cyber Deception. Part 2 in Switchshop's Defense in Depth series. Before handing over to Mark and Nick at Attivo Networks, I'd just like to take you through some brief housekeeping. To the right side of the screen, you will see a chat box. This is a public chat where you can alert us to any issues you may be encountering or anything else that you'd like to let us know. The next tab is for questions. We encourage you to ask questions throughout, as we'd like this to be an interactive session. So please place any questions you may have there. These are private and will only be seen by presenters. So now I'd like to hand over to Mark Howell at Attivo Networks.
Thanks, Jen. I'm assuming everybody can hear me. So welcome. I'm sure in the current climate, you've probably sat through a number of these. So look, please make this interactive. As Jen has said, I'd like to reiterate that. Lots of questions. I don't want this to be a lecture. Lots of questions so that we can get a bit more as interactive as we can be with this system. So just by way of introduction, my name's Mark Howell. I run Europe for Attivo Networks, and my colleague Nick is the technical director who will be joining shortly and delivering a bit more technical content after my session. So really, look, today is all about just informing you, educating you. Please ask lots of questions, as I've said, inspiring you, explaining some ideas, hopefully maybe converging some thinking or some knowledge that you may have around cyber deception to really get across that cyber deception's complementary with a defense in depth strategy. And if you're interested in looking more deeply at this, please get in touch with Switchshop after the presentation. So Switchshop and I actually go back a long way. It's testament to Switchshop as to how many people are on today. I've worked with Switchshop ever since my days at Maru Networks back in from 2008. So they're a very well-respected company and one that I absolutely trust, and it's great that they're on board with Attivo as a channel partner. So look, what are we talking about today? We're talking about threat detection and response, okay? But what I want to explain is some thinking and some concepts around deception, okay? Now, many of you, will know the old story of the Trojan horse. It gave its name to a kind of malicious computer, virus in the past. But basically, this was one of the earliest uses of deception to gain an advantage on an opponent. So the Greeks pretended to sail away. The Trojans, saw this lovely great horse that the Greeks had left outside the city, pulled it in. Out came the soldiers, slayed the city of Troy. A fantastic deception that totally changed the course of that battle. Now, if we start sort of thinking laterally, deception as a tactic has been used forever in all forms of opponent scenarios. And what I want to get across is, look, it's attackers' main weapon on us. If you think of a spear phishing email, it is specifically designed to deceive us, to click on something for that attacker to get a point of presence in your network from which to launch some sort of campaign. And I think all of you on the call are pragmatic enough to know that in today's current climate of this attack surface growing, attackers will get in. And to, protect yourselves best, stopping that attack from proliferating once it is in, reducing that dwell time, reducing the reputational damage is absolutely critical. And what we are simply saying is use the tactic of deception back. So In sport, we see it all the time. In rugby, in football, whatever it is, any sport, you will see deception used both offensively and defensively. In world wars, so, I know there's a lot of universities and colleges and bright NHS people on the call, and it's not a test of history, but Operation Mincemeat was a classic deception that the Allies played on the Germans. We took a dead body, we dressed it up in clothing, soldiers' clothing, put a passport on it, fake plans, dropped it off the beach of Spain. The Spanish gave it to the Germans. They were neutral at the time. And the Germans read all these plans, and these plans were fake. They were specifically designed to deceive the Germans. Okay, they thought we were going to attack via Sardinia. We attacked via Sicily, and hey presto, it changed the course of the Second World War, such that Churchill stated, in wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. Now, that moves me on to a point, which is attackers will get in. We've kind of established that. We know that happens. There's no point, presenting to you all the examples of where this has happened in NHS, government, universities. It happens, okay? And what we are simply saying is, use the tactic of deception back. And actually, our retired Chief of Defence Intelligence, Phil Osborne, has specifically come out and stated that we have to use these tactics of deception and counter-deception that are commonplace in military physical wars. We need to be using that in our cyber war to help protect our reputations, protect our critical national infrastructure, protect the research that we're looking after in universities, protect our students' data, whatever it is, defend our rule of law and politics. We've got to use those tactics. So, many of you will have heard of Gartner, many of you will have heard of MITRE, the MITRE attack framework, and many of you will have heard of NIST. As I've stated, what we are saying is use the tactic of deception on the wire, and we call that cyber deception. So, Gartner, NIST, MITRE, all talking about it. MITRE, and if you're more interested, you can grab this paper from Switchshop. MITRE wrote a lovely paper in January about the benefits of cyber deception and the value of it. How you can use it to find and manage adversaries, learn their techniques better, find insider threats, create better incident response. And I think this flows in nicely to the webinars that Switchshop are doing. This is not a standalone solution. This will integrate with your current security stack, okay, and help you with automations to deal with threats. And Nick will cover that later on in the presentation. And MITRE talk about pocket litter, digital pocket litter. And very simply, what cyber deception does, or what Attivo does, is inside your network, we put down fake information, fake assets, fake servers, fake R&D, fake documents, exactly designed to mimic your assets, okay? And Nick will explain later how we do that, how we make it so real and authentic. But we put these assets outside of the normal workflow of a good user. Okay, so what that means is nothing should talk to our solution. By design, it is quiet. But when something touches what we've put down, you will get an alert. That is a high fidelity alert. Nobody should be anywhere near what we've put down. So when we alert, you absolutely know you have a problem. And MITRE wrote a very good paper on this back in January. Now, many of you may be thinking, oh, it just sounds like honeypots. Oh, we've done that in our university, or we've done that on our NHS network, or wherever. So, yeah, thanks. I've just seen a question come in. I'll cover that in a second. But look, honeypots were always designed to kind of stand out. they were kind of low interaction emulations. What you can do with Cyberdeception is deploy this at scale quickly. And if we have time, we'll show later on how we do that, how easy it is to do. And we can make them look absolutely real and mimic the exact assets that you have. And we can do this, at scale in a huge, in some breadth and comprehensibility. Okay, so NIST have been talking about cyber deception for some time. Many of you, as I've said, will have heard of NIST. They wrote a paper 853 about decoys, concealment, misdirection, about how that provides insight into attackers' TTPs, how it can deflect attackers away from operational systems. 800-160 was a paper they wrote about developing cyber resilient systems. And they have 14 key techniques to develop cyber resiliency. And actually one is deception. And they talk about obfuscation, disinformation, misdirection, how that leads an adversary to waste effort, change the economics of attack. So if it's really difficult for them to make progress moving laterally within your organization, they might well give up and go somewhere else. That unpredictability creates them problems as attackers. So we call this, we've often called this active cyber defense. Okay, and MITRE have just started talking about active defense, which I'm going to come on to in a second. So 800-171B was another paper that they wrote very similar to 800-160 about how cyber deception can confuse and mislead adversaries, buy you time, impact their decision-making progress, degrade the adversary's ability to move laterally. So, as I've kind of said, some of you may or may not have SOCs, but you'll probably receive logs somehow from some systems, and you'll be getting a lot of them, and many of them will be, will be false positives. Okay, the beauty of a deception solution is it's quiet by design. Okay, it won't overwhelm your SOC, but you'll damn well know if someone touches something that we've put down, it's a high fidelity alert. And certainly in NHS environments and health environments that we've deployed in previously, very often these, patient critical systems that are networked in often cannot be patched, and by their nature are vulnerable. What we can actually do is take those gold images of those systems, mimic them, put them on the network as direct replicas of your original systems, so that you can very easily see, crikey, if someone's poking one of the fake ones, we've probably got a problem. Okay, so lots of ways to help protect legacy environments and environments that you can't patch to a way that you might want to. So I'll quickly move on from that slide. Gartner have talked about this a lot. I know many of you will follow Gartner. It was one of their top 10 technology trends in 2018, and now in 2020 it's kind of number 2: threat detection and response and improving the SOC. Gartner as well talk about this being a 0 to 12 month initiative for organizations. They came out with that statement in May 2020. So this is a good time to be looking at this. There's a lot of analyst opinion. There's a great business case behind it for organizations, because I'm sure you've all spent a lot of money on perimeter solutions, sort of building the walls around things. But as we know, attackers find clever ways to get in. And when they're in, you need to find a clever way of finding them. And deception provides that. So in terms of MITRE, there is obviously, I'm sure you've heard of the MITRE attack framework. There's a specific area that Attivo fits into, which is credential access, discovery, lateral movement, and collection. So I'm sure many of you have got EDR solutions, and a common a common objection is, well, what does cyber deception give me over and above EDR? Well, here it is in plain sight how cyber deception applies to the MITRE attack framework. And this is just the same slide blown up. But I think of real importance, which is hot off the press, is MITRE Shield. Many of you are thinking, what's this guy smoking? What is MITRE Shield? Well, it's 3 weeks. It's 3 weeks out from MITRE. It's a publicly available guide called Shield, and it catalogs measures that organizations can take to actively engage with and counter intruders on their networks. And on page 1, it specifically names cyber deception. And what it is a collection of research as to the active defense techniques that organizations should be using once an attacker is already in. Okay. And it is hot off the press and very much worth reading. There are multiple ways in which MITRE are encouraging organizations to use what they are calling an active defense. And it could have come out of our marketing playbook, because we've been calling this active cyber defense for some time, since we were born in 2011 and since we've been shipping products since 2015. But, here is kind of how cyber deception maps to those techniques within MITRE Shield. So great, often organizations ask us, look, we love what you do. We've seen it in action. Help me build the business case. And these are some very useful ways in which you can build the use case, particularly MITRE Shield recently. So look, I'm going to hand over to Nick. I think it's 2:17 now, but you won't see. So the whole point of cyber deception is that it's under the radar. Okay. From a marketing perspective, that makes things really difficult for me. There's probably only 2 public case studies out there on the web about Attivo. It's a US university and a US insurer. Okay. We have around 350 customers worldwide. There's 200 employees. We've got offices in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, India, Dubai, North and South America. And but you will not see lots and lots of public case studies. It defeats the object, of deception, and in our view, security in general. Okay, advertising what you're running probably isn't the best thing to do. It's like advertising what type of lock I've got on my front door to all my neighbors, some of whom might not be particularly nice people. But I just wanted to share this. This is a recent customer of ours in the UK. It happens to be a council, but I think the key thing was, this is a reference they wrote to us for an RFP recently, but what I wanted to cover was, why did they consider this? Why did they deploy it? And really, if you look at the bullet points, what they wanted was high fidelity detection of threats that had already got in. They've only got a small team. They didn't want to waste their time dealing with, lots and lots of logs and lots of false positives and not knowing where to look. Number 3, they wanted something that was quick to deploy. Nick will probably cover some of that. Ensure minimal false positives, provide early clear warning of threats. They've got pretty high turnover of staff, so they were worried about insider threats, documents going missing, etc., etc. We know we've seen that in one private healthcare establishment in the UK. That was an insider took a database, published it, and it was pretty damaging to the organization. And actually, they also said they didn't want to rely on one vendor for all of their security solutions. Some of the big players, they will always say, yeah, we can do everything at every layer of the stack. Well, not strictly true. And also going with one vendor for everything that you do, may or may not be the right strategy. Now, the last point was the protection against ransomware and Active Directory threats. Nick's going to cover that in more detail, how our cyber deception covers those specific use cases. So look, I'm going to hand over to Nick. I can see a question about how we conceal our solution from advanced attackers. Nick, I'm going to ask you to cover that in your piece.
Understood. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. So guys, I would like to just go into the architecture a little bit, and I'm going to come on to the question about advanced attackers in a second, because by its very nature, a deception solution is something that nothing should be talking to. And from that perspective, what we were aiming to do is to catch attackers that have avoided all other forms of detection. So the guys that have managed to tiptoe past your existing defenses or simply teleport past them are the ones really that we're interested in attacking. The commodity protections that you have in place will be taking care of the vast majority of the malware and the kind of the internet-based scripts and those kinds of things. What we're seeking to do with this is to give an additional layer of protection for the really malicious stuff. And so with that in mind, we really typically open these conversations with a view, a set of metrics that I'm fairly sure you guys will be familiar with, that talks about how quickly and how invasively an attacker can compromise an environment. Now, this slide isn't all bad news. You know, the average dwell time, the time taken by a typical defending team to discover an attacker, has come down. I mean, I've been presenting variations on this slide for several years now, and the average dwell time has come down from about 400 days to about 78 days. That said, things like, for example, the Carbonac malware, which got to domain admin on that Eastern European bank within a couple of hours, really illustrating the fact that the attackers now understand that they have to be more surgical in their approach, and they have to exfiltrate quicker rather than get discovered. So it's with these metrics in mind, lateral movement and the privilege escalation, that we see a need to necessarily start to insert ourselves into the attacker workflow early, and to actually protect against early ingresses into the attack. And so from that particular perspective, if I move on to a slide here, which will describe really what we do. Now,
it's not building on this platform, Nick.
That's fine. Okay, so if you ignore the fake word for a second, let's just take, because it's kind of giving the game away a little bit, but that's we'll work around that. If you imagine an attacker who has issued a precision-crafted spear phishing email into your environment, so they've used all of the resources they have available in terms of social engineering. They've looked at Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and they have enough information about one of your staff members, not only to name the job that they do and the technologies that they're interested in, but also probably to name their kids, their birthdays, and members of their family. And so with that in mind, when that spear phishing email comes in, the weaponized mail, there's a strong likelihood that they'll be one of the N% of your staff that will click on the link. And if they do click on the link, the attacker then has a point of presence on the workstation. And his first question is around situational awareness. Where have I landed? What can I see? And what might be stopping me? And if the attacker doesn't like the flavor of antivirus or EDR software he finds on that machine, he will just turn it off. The average malware leaving the production facilities now has got something like 300 kill points in for the common or garden AV and EDR solutions. And so once that AV solution is turned off, all of your existing controls have failed. The firewall, the IDS, the IPS, the email filtering, and the AV and EDR. And it's in that environment where the attacker then has one question only, and that is, where do I go next? And in seeking to enumerate the environment, that machine he's landed on is a rich source of situational awareness for not only the machine itself, but obviously the surrounding networks. So he might look in memory for passwords, for credentials. You know, this is how Carbonac got lucky. One of the first hops that they made on the environment chanced upon a domain admin password cached in memory. This would be game over, really, for most environments, because obviously then straight to the domain controller, install the backdoors, create the backdoor accounts, and then really the attacker becomes impossible to find. Similarly, connections to other systems. You know, if you perform a net stat on any domain joined machine, if you perform a quick poke into the RDP cache, the SSH cache, the browser cookies, the browser bookmarks. You'll have information not only about the intranet environment, but also the other machines that might well be being connected to from the compromised client. So all of a sudden, the attacker knows more about your naming conventions and about your IP addressing conventions. Overwhelmingly, number 3 here, you'll see the attacker can query Active Directory. Now, you will, I'm sure, be aware of the zero login vulnerability, which is effectively a Python script that can be sent towards a DC that will give you access to the DC without any credentials at all. This is a brand new vulnerability. And so if the attacker can enumerate your domain controllers, either by name or by IP address, he can hack your environment. Now, with that specifically in mind, it was the case for the longest time that attackers would tiptoe around Active Directory, but increasingly now we're seeing them getting a lot more bullish in their attacks there. The attacker can also advertise themselves as a legitimate internal server, perform a man-in-the-middle attack, pretend to be some kind of source of name resolution for clients that have run out of options and harvest credentials from them as he broadcasts himself as a legitimate internal box. And then moving forward, things like network reconnaissance, network scans. People thought, again, for the longest time, attackers don't scan anymore. They do, but they'll be doing it, 1 or 2 packets an hour to individual IP addresses to do a slow enumeration of the environment. And then obviously ransomware, destructware, wiperware, whatever you want to call it. Increasingly, attackers are using that as a diversion tactic. This is not just about smash and grab anymore. Attackers will be launching ransomware attacks to divert attention from other activities on the network. And a lot of our financial services colleagues talk about including this in their playbooks. If you see some kind of denial of service or relatively gross kind of attack, an unsophisticated attack like that going on, the likelihood is that the attackers are using deception on you. And then the final piece, document access. What is on this network about, enumeration of business processes, about key staff members, about intellectual property. What can we learn, for example, about the naming convention, about the network architecture? There will always be information in file shares and in repositories that the attacker can use. Indeed, we've spoken to a red team fairly recently who were able to get to domain admin in 15 minutes, not 2 hours, but 15 minutes by virtue of a very useful unencrypted spreadsheet on a shared drive that had a bunch of admin passwords in it. So even with the very best policies, people are still the weakest link. And all of this information is a rich source of not only situational awareness, but also lateral movement opportunities for attackers. And this allows them to move across the environment to a situation where they have basically a strategic advantage to move into an environment where they can start to derive value from the infrastructure, rather than if the situation were changed and we were to make all of this stuff fake, they would be generating alerts for us. Now, really, that's the point of this slide. I'm trying to present deception on a single slide that says, regardless of the attacker workflow, regardless of how they're trying to enumerate the environment, regardless of the methods that they are using, we can get it to a stage where we feed them fake reconnaissance information and give them a fake attack surface to interact with. And when they do, we're the ones that are getting the alerts. We're the ones that are getting the situational awareness, and we are the ones who are aware of their presence prior to them actually either gaining domain admin and vanishing from view, or actually exfiltrating something of value. Then the next you hear of it, you've got a 3-letter agency knocking on your door, or the profound reputational damage that we know that accompanies this kind of exfiltration. So I've got one eye on the notifications for questions. Mark, please keep me honest here. But I think from that perspective, what we'll do is move on to the architecture, because a deception architecture really has to be simple. We're very aware production IT is enough of a task on its own, keeping the lights on production systems without giving people deceptive systems to manage as well. And with that in mind, the Attivo solution is mostly self-installing and almost completely self-managing. And the reason for that is because we connect our capabilities into pre-existing networks, we use a lot of the information that we find there to build our deception campaigns. So at the center of the installation here, you'll see a thing called the BotSync, which is a physical, virtual, or cloud-based appliance. So this is as at home in Azure and AWS and Oracle Cloud and Google Cloud as it is in Hyper-V, VMware, OpenStack, and as it is as physical appliances. So the connectivity that we provide here for this appliance is typically into cloud-based environments or data center networks over VLAN trunks. That gives us visibility of the environment, and it allows us to create assets effectively recycled from the appliance itself that look like they are resident on those networks. So the orange assets here, the servers and workstations, are all fake. Those are the things which give the attacker the initial attack surface. These will respond to pokes, prods, and attacks, brute force attacks, attempts to log in, exploits, all of those kinds of things. And that gives us visibility of the kinds of things that might be happening on that network. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. Primarily in the context of the lower portion of the diagram where you see SCADA, IoT, and POS type environments. Now, we all know that IoT is a profound risk, not least because you can very, very quickly and very easily chance upon admin level passwords for IoT devices just from a commodity perspective on the internet. You know, an awful lot of these things are already very, very well understood by attackers because they are so commodity. And so with that in mind, when we think of things like the Tor botnet, which frankly is not interested in making your cameras into DDoS devices, it's interested in pivoting into your environment. And so an awful lot of the successful ingresses that we see into production networks now are from the relatively less visible parts of the environment, like OT and IoT. So it's with that in mind that we are increasingly seeing these network level decoys as a very valuable first point of visibility. Imagine if you have an attacker who has compromised a CCTV camera network and is pivoting onto the production environment. Their first point of visibility is going to be those stealthy network scans and those stealthy reconnaissances. And so with that in mind, if they are aware of the fact that you probably have IDSs or IPSs on the network to detect those scans, then they're going to tune down that activity, and they're going to be seeking to avail themselves of a pattern of activity that doesn't wake up those solutions, which means that the only thing that's going to detect them is solutions to which nothing should be talking at all. And in that instance, that's where deception comes in. Now, if you turn your attention to the blue devices in the main body of the diagram, the blues and the grays, which are the real workstations and the real servers, if you imagine an attacker compromising one of those devices and performing what you might consider to be, in quotes, normal attacker workflow. So the attacker is on the user network and he's on one of the actual real laptops, the blue laptops. He might scrape memory for a password. He might look in the cache for connections to other systems. He might do a NetStack connection. He might look in the browser cookies or the bookmarks. He might perform network level reconnaissance, light scans. All of that information on that real machine would typically normally lead him into a production system. But because of that little orange deceptive credential card there, which contains a lot of information about fake assets on the network, about fake passwords, about fake connections into other systems, we are messing with the attacker's workflow and actively leading him into the decoy assets. And this is critical because we are not just putting decoys down on the network and expecting an attacker to find them. We are actively shaping not only his psychology, but his TTPs to interact with them. Because the information that he finds on the workstation, he would be expecting to lead him into real assets, and we make sure it's all fake. So with that in mind, what we're doing is we are actively shaping the attacker's methods and his destinations into systems that are going to give us visibility rather than give him value and strategic advantage. Additionally, we've got some capabilities around ransomware and more specifically around Active Directory, which I want to go into in a little bit more detail. So again, I'm just going to pause for a second to check the questions. I think we're
just the one, Nick.
Sure. About authenticity and about
how do you conceal the solution from advanced attackers?
Okay, so now, and from that perspective, I think one of the key points here really is about what you would expect an advanced attacker to have visibility of. So, for example, an attacker is going to enumerate an environment. He's going to use things like IP address conventions. He's going to look at things like DNS names, whether these things appear in DNS. He's going to look at the MAC addresses of devices he's talking to, all as an attempt to validate the authenticity and the truth of the asset he's about to talk to. Similarly, he might look in Active Directory. He might identify a device or an asset of interest in AD or on the network and query AD. Is this a real device? Has it got a logon history? Is there an active session associated with it? So with all of those things in mind, the attacker is actively looking to interact with these assets, but only based on his ability to discern them as real.
Nick, one other question. How do you make Attivo appealing to attackers? Question mark. Make it blend in. I think you kind of covered it, but
yeah, and I think to that point, a lot of what we're talking about here about inserting ourselves into the attacker workflow, because attackers only have a certain number of ways that they can enumerate an environment, and only a certain number of ways that they can gain access to assets. And so typically, based on the fact that still the vast majority of successful entries into an environment happen on a compromised workstation, this is really our first point of visibility and our first point of interaction with the attacker. So by making sure that there is fake information, fake assets, fake passwords, fake clues. I mean, imagine a trail of breadcrumbs from a production workstation into a decoy. This is really what we're doing. The attacker's only got a certain number of things he can do to identify destination systems. And even if, for example, he's querying things like AD directly, there are ways that we can point him into the fake stuff rather than giving him access to the real stuff. And that's something I think I'll come on to in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So, really, with that in mind, what we're doing is, if you start from the bottom of this affectionately titled pancake slide, whichever the choices you're making about your IT supply chain, whether you're leveraging a hybrid environment comprising physical, virtual, and cloud, or whether you are committed to a particular technology, Attivo has got a properly architected. When I say properly architected, I mean that the cloud solutions offer cloud-specific deceptions, like deceptive buckets, like storage blobs, like Lambda functions. And the virtualized solutions sit specifically on their target environment. So we've architected several different layers of our solution to make use of those different supply chain choices that might have been made. From a deception perspective, the operating systems and the applications are fully customizable. You can make them your own. You can include industrial control systems, IoT, medical devices, any of those kind of more exotic things. And then the user data at the top really is about providing that trail of breadcrumbs that leads the attack into these systems to provide the alerting. So with all of that in mind, the final thing, I guess, from an ecosystem perspective is what do we talk to? How can we use your existing investments in your infrastructure and technology to effectively sweat those assets? For example, you may have pre-existing workflows and automations and incident response that leverage automations into these solutions. And effectively what we're doing with Attivo is we're taking a perspective of being another event feed that's necessarily a relatively higher fidelity feed, and say, if we have an alert, if an attacker is talking to decoy systems, then how about we quarantine him? We block his connection to the internet to remove any command and control, or we block access to the local network, or we perform an automatic capture for forensics, or we route him into a part of the network where he's only got decoys to play with. So an awful lot of these kind of conditional questions that you can start to ask about your SOAR, your orchestration and response capabilities, can leverage all of these things, or can plumb straight into the orchestration layer because we use those capabilities so closely anyway. Additionally, the ability to automatically ticket and to take lessons from production observations about what attackers have done and feed those, for example, into a SIM solution, or feed those into a SIM solution for incorporation into queries that you make about the production environment. This is a really important one. If an attacker finds a fake username and password on a workstation, if he authenticates with that into a decoy system, there's a very, very clear chain of causation. The attacker has got decoy credentials and he's using them on a decoy system. This is a very clear indicator of compromise. However, if the attacker's got decoy credentials and he's using them on production systems, that would manifest as a failed login. But there's intelligence in there. There is valuable information that we have a failed login on a production system, but that login shouldn't have been done by anybody because it's a credential that's been placed in memory that's been dug out and can only have been dug out using nefarious means. So all of these integrations very, very closely play into visibility, not only into the deception environment, but also into the production assets as well. So moving on, just really to talk a little bit about how we protect Active Directory. Now, this is a really important use case because effectively from within AD, we have the ability to as an attacker, has the ability to enumerate the entire environment, and with a couple of commands, particularly with novel vulnerabilities that have just been discovered, to own the entire domain. Now, from that perspective, without making changes to production AD, if you imagine the diagram on the right really is a description of the entire environment. If you see the attacker that's compromised the workstation there, he doesn't even need to escalate privileges. He can start to query AD for real accounts from that session. And AD with a clear conscience will return that information. Me as a non-domain admin user authenticated to any network can say DC list and get a list of domain controllers. Or I can say netgroup domain admin to get a list of domain admins. I can issue a Kerberos query to get Kerberos tickets. And when I've enumerated the IP address and the name of that DC, even without Kerberosing, I can now actually compromise that DC. So what we're doing here really with the real AD query results that are being returned at position kind of 6 o'clock on this diagram, slightly north of that, ADSecure, our endpoint technology, replaces that with fake stuff that then routes the attacker into a deceptive environment and keeps them away from the production assets. And again, critically important, because what it's doing is it's giving us the ability to start to serve fake reconnaissance information to the attacker that not only is going to change his psychology and his methods, but is also going to keep him busy in fake assets that are giving you visibility of his TTPs rather than allowing him to interact with real assets and risk losing him and compromising the entire domain. So ADSecure is a lightweight endpoint service that runs on the environment that will typically intercept real attacks from attackers about AD, querying AD, trying to enumerate AD, and give them fake information that leads them into our decoys. Mark, I think I heard a chime for another question coming in. Can you take a look at that?
Sure, yeah. How easy is it to deploy your technology? Is it disruptive? Does it require extensive professional services?
Okay. It's a great question, and it's one I think I've got a specific slide for a little later, but the short answer is no. We use a lot of machine learning, a lot of visibility of your broadcast and multicast traffic to figure out what a good deception solution is going to look like and then automatically create it. Plus the fact you saw the integration slide previously, that includes things like our deployment technology. So we can very easily slipstream into standard packaging and deployment capabilities to get our endpoint solution out to endpoints using SCCM or WMI, Casper, Tanium, McAfee. So there are a whole raft of ways that we can incorporate or insert ourselves into the standard business processes that deploy technologies to your network. Let me talk about that in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. Now, I think from a protection perspective, one of the other things I wanted to talk about was mitigation of ransomware. Now, again, this would normally build, but if you look at the workstation in the middle of the screen, the icon there on the workstation represents the Attivo endpoint detection net. This is our lightweight service, and what it's doing is it's monitoring that workstation for indicators of cryptographic activity, such that if we see multiple sequential file operations, changing file suffixes, high velocity activity on that workstation that we can safely interpret as ransomware, then we do two things. The first thing is we hide the file shares, the network attached storage from that machine. Effectively, the ransomware then has no visibility of network connected devices with data it can encrypt. We also protect the file system of that machine. We hide Windows and Windows system, and we hide the critical assets. You can hide documents, PDF files, zip files, spreadsheets. And effectively what we're doing there is we're hiding from the cryptographic process anything that might be valuable from an encryption perspective to the attacker. Then if you look at the assets that we place to the right-hand side and the lower part of the screen, that's our appliance and a fake file share there. And what we do in that area is we do a thing called feed the beast. The feed the beast activity will effectively allow us to send an infinite library of fake data to that cryptographic process. And so from that perspective, the cryptographic process will allow us is allowed then to encrypt data that it can never finish. We are feeding the beast with an infinite library of fake data. We keep it busy, we throttle a network connection, and we feed the data for encryption at a reduced rate so that you have enough time to get visibility of the malware attack, and so that we can automatically quarantine using the integrations you saw on the previous slide to get that machine off the network and to automatically minimize the chance of it propagating to any important devices. So that's our ransomware protection. So effectively, we are deceiving ransomware in the same way as we're doing anything else. Somebody came off mute. Is there a question?
No, it's just me.
Okay. So from that perspective, this is a means by which we can then mitigate the risk of ransomware propagating to the real environment, as well as protecting Active Directory, and as well as providing a dense mesh of fake assets on the environment to which nothing should be talking to. So effectively, we've got a kind of a multi-phase approach that regardless of the attacker workflow, regardless of the method that they're using, they will bump into something deceptive and they will give their position away. Now, from that perspective then, and I guess to the question that we just had, I've got a few slides on deployment, and I really want to present this as consciously as a very simplistic thing, because that's what it is. You know, the appliance, whether it's physical, virtual, or cloud, is connected to a VLAN trunk on the network. And effectively, by supplying VLANs into the appliance, we can automatically enumerate and discover the network. Now, from that perspective, then, by learning the environment and by learning the broadcast and multicast traffic patterns, and by using probes to identify the assets and the types of traffic they're producing on the network, we have the ability then to create effectively an optional, point number 3 here, an optional dirty line straight to the internet, such that if an attacker does land on our decoys and then does try to perform a DNS lookup against a criminal domain, or start to try and talk out to download second or third stage payloads, we can automatically get visibility of that. And that can then be incorporated into things like snort rules, where we can get visibility of that as an indicator of compromise on another machine. So what I mean by that, let's say, for example, that we've got an attacker on the network, has identified a credential of interest, has used it to compromise a deceptive asset, and has tried to dial out to, let's say, a device in the 151.10 domain. By capturing that IP, that command and control IP, whether it's known to any threat intelligence sources at all, we can then start to use that to get visibility of other devices in the network that might already be talking to that command and control. So in other words, you can get recyclable visibility and information about malicious assets that might be on the internet that are talked to that have no registration in commonly accessible threat databases at this stage. So we're effectively giving you visibility almost like of a 0 day in that instance. And from that perspective, then the learning based on the network traffic that we have allows us then to start to deploy assets on the environment. Whether you're talking about commodity operating systems, you know, for example, our BotSync has several virtual machines on board that can be used to deploy decoys. We've got literally thousands and thousands. There's 2,000 decoys available from a single appliance, but they are ultimately will link back to single VMs on the appliance itself. So think of a dense mesh of deceptive IP addresses that are all routing an attacker back to a much lower, more manageable volume of VMs on an appliance or in a virtualized environment. Additionally, as very important, again, to the point about authenticity and about configuration of the deceptive assets to be convincing, if you choose, for example, to use a particular flavor, maybe of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Oracle Enterprise Linux, a particular flavor of Windows Server configured with particular applications, then we can take that information in as gold images. You know, you can just import an instrumented gold image in a VMDK or QCOW format, and then use that from a deception perspective to serve deception to the environment that looks exactly like your production assets. So we tend to use a combination of commodity Linux and Windows systems and specific gold images to create a convincing deception fabric.
Nick, how long does that take? So, a customer wants to deploy lots of decoys that look identical to their specific server build. How long does it take to create those?
So effectively, the learning process within the environment is configurable. But in order to be able to physically properly learn the environment and to get the information ready for creation by the appliance, we're talking typically an hour or two. The visibility on production VLANs would be enough to give us a really good start at configuring and creating deceptive assets that look like what's on that network.
Okay.
So I guess moving on then, when we start deploying the decoys, the bot sync, the solution itself has visibility of VLANs via the VLAN trunk connection, and then we can explicitly map the decoy VMs. You see the Windows 2008, CentOS, Ubuntu, Windows 7 machines there onto specific VLANs that we have visibility of. So you then have very clear graphical representation, not only of the assets resident on VLAN 299 there, but also their blend in terms of real assets to decoys. And with that in mind, that then gives you additional visibility of the active, inactive, and decoy assets on a network. And you can subject those to control as well. So if you have a controlled environment, maybe medical devices, maybe payment infrastructure, then you can very, very quickly supply enforcement rules into the bot sync to say, if I have visibility of a new asset on that network or a new VLAN or any changes to the production environment at all, then give me an alert, because obviously you want to police access to the environment very, very closely, very strongly. And again, to that point, learning the environment and learning by either our own machine learning, by plugging into Active Directory, by enumerating the critical assets, by enumerating the privileged credentials, we're in a position where we can start to offer advice and guidance on best practice in the environment. I'm going to come on to that a little bit later, but effectively what we're talking about with this is either using machine learning or our own gold images. You can formulate a composite of the real environment based on real observations and based on gold images to make sure that the deception environment is particularly convincing to attackers. What we then do is we then put the fake credentials on the workstations. And this is the trail of breadcrumbs that leads the attacker into the decoy assets. So effectively available not only for Windows, Linux, and Mac, but also on cloud environments as well. We're talking about credentials in memory, LSAS, credentials in the caches, browser cookies, browser bookmarks, FTP connections, network shares. So from that perspective, we've got the ability then to place this dense mesh of fake reconnaissance information onto the workstations, the real workstations, so that if an attacker lands there and starts to scrape memory for passwords or look for connections to other computers, the ones that he finds are the ones that lead to decoys.
Nick, quick one before you get carried away. 7 minutes, and it's a hard stop. We get literally thrown off. But question: we get red teamed on a regular basis, and the results are often quite worrying. Would Attivo be prepared to deploy their solution during our next red team test to test the efficacy of the solution? I guess that's probably more for me. So the answer to that is yes. What we would typically do is in larger organizations, we would typically do a consult with the organization, understand where they've had issues previously, deploy a small production trial into that specific area, and direct the red team into that area, and we would then be able to show you what we would find of that red team behavior and how quickly we could have removed that potential attacker if they were a real attacker, not a red team. So absolutely, yes, we do that all the time. I think there are a number of universities on here. I'm about to do that in one particular university, but answer yes. So Nick, just conscious of 6 minutes of time. I think you've got one or two more slides.
There's only a couple more. That's right.
Okay, sorry.
So from that perspective, really, I guess because we are very focused on deception, detection by deception, particularly detection is what we do. We also like to provide guidance and advisory to customers about how to harden their environments. So in this instance, things like ThreatPath is a means by which we can identify where there are orphaned privileged credentials on the network. Critically important, as I say, this is how Carbonac did it. This is how WannaCry did it. You know, if there is a domain admin or a privileged level credential somewhere on the network, the malware will find it, and when it finds it, you are in a world of pain. And from that perspective, what we're seeking to do, because we provide visibility into Active Directory, because we provide visibility of privileged credentials and where they live on the network, you can provide automations which will remove these from machines and provide advice on how to harden that machine from a policy perspective. For example, you know, stronger encryption on Kerberos, clearing the page file at shutdown. We've got about 35 different ways that we provide guidance in that instance. And what that will then do is give you the ability to then harden the network, remove possible lateral movement paths, and get a better handle on the susceptibility of the network to attack. So I think, Mark, from that perspective, that's probably a good place to leave it. Obviously, thanks for everyone's attention. If there are any other questions, I'd be delighted to take any.
So, Nick, I guess we've got 4 minutes. I'll give a sort of brief on how we license. So, as I hope has been sort of clear, there's a kind of central brain. It's called the bot sync. Typically a customer will purchase a bot sync, and effectively licensed by the number of endpoints. So there's sort of 3 key features as part of our license, which is the threat strike, which is where we put the lures and the breadcrumbs on the endpoints. Threat path, which Nick has just described, where we can visually show you how an attacker could move laterally through the network, and we can actually remediate that as well. And then the third part of the license is the ADSecure functionality, where we can give an attacker fake information when they enumerate Active Directory. That all forms one license, which is called our EDN license, and we effectively license that by the number of endpoints that we are putting that Attivo service down onto. So that's basically how it's done. Yeah, that's it from us. I hope that was useful. Jen, I don't know if you want to open up the lines or not open up the lines. Entirely up to you what you'd like to do next. But please all get in touch with Switchshop if you want to. That they know their stuff. Well-respected partner of ours. And thanks for your time.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Nick. That was a really informative session. As they both said, if anyone does have any further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with anyone here at Switchshop or with Mark and Nick. And just a reminder, we hope to see you all at our next webinar of the series, which will be next Wednesday at 4 p.m. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely day.